There's something addictive about crash landings in games. Maybe it's the way chaos instantly becomes opportunity. Maybe it's because it's the perfect excuse to throw a character into a world that wants them dead, and let the player figure out what to do about it. That's the setup for Hostile Lands, a 2D top-down roguelite shooter that wastes no time in getting you into the fight. You crash, you're mistaken for an enemy, and before you can explain, bullets are already flying. But here's where Hostile Lands hooks you. It doesn't just throw waves of enemies at you and hope for the best. It builds tension through variety, in levels, weapons, characters, and the kinds of chaos that emerge when those systems collide. Every run in Hostile Lands is procedurally generated. That means each time you play, the environment shifts. The bosses rotate. The weapons you stumble across are different. The layout of enemy patrols changes. It's a familiar roguelite formula, but it works because of the pace. You're not crawling through a dungeon. You're sprinting, dodging, flanking, and adapting. And when it comes to weapons, Hostile Lands leans into that classic, just one more chest feeling. There are 8 core gun types: pistols, revolvers, SMGs, shotguns, sniper rifles, assault rifles, crossbows, and a fan favorite, blade guns. Each one handles differently, and most players will gravitate to a preferred style. But the real fun is in experimentation. Finding a sniper rifle early changes your entire tempo. Picking up a blade gun in the middle of a frantic wave might save your life, or get you killed. Risk reward is baked into every pickup. Characters in Hostile Lands add another layer. Each one brings a unique, active skill, something you can use once per level, and a passive buff that influences your run minute to minute. For example, Robert's Blazing Barrels turns him into a whirlwind of damage, perfect for thinning out tight groups. Meanwhile, Maria's Psych Strike lets you flip enemies against each other, creating moments of chaos that you can slip through unnoticed. That balance between controlled aggression and tactical ability is what gives the game its flow. You're not just aiming better, you're thinking faster. The world itself is split into 7 regions, each with its own aesthetic, enemies, and tone. One zone might be overgrown and swampy, slowing movement and vision. Another might be metallic and claustrophobic, turning every corner into a potential ambush. Bosses are swapped out too, which gives returning players something fresh to react to, and makes each end-of-level fight more than just a routine checkpoint. But maybe the smartest part of Hostile Lands is how it handles progression. It's easy to forget how many roguelites start you over with nothing, again and again. Here, the devs decided to make every run contribute to something bigger. That tech you earn with each attempt can be spent on permanent upgrades. It's not game-breaking, but it does shift your mindset. Even a failed run isn't a waste of time. It's fuel. It keeps the dopamine drip going, even after a brutal loss. Then there are the modes. Normal mode gives you space to learn. Hard mode turns up the enemy count, the bullets, the speed, everything. And then there's survival, which strips out the progression altogether and just asks one question: how long can you last? And that's where the soul of the game really is. Hostile Lands isn't about building the perfect run. It's about adapting when that run falls apart. About switching from sniper to shotgun mid-fight because the room didn't go how you thought it would. About remembering your character's skill at the last second and using it to clutch a win. It's reactive, responsive, scrappy. Yes, it's in early access, but it's not in that we're missing half the game phase. What's here feels complete, and what's not is clearly on the way. The developers are present, responding to feedback, and open about where the game is headed. That's promising. If you're into games like Nuclear Throne, 20 Minutes Till Dawn, Soulstone Survivors, or even the moment-to-moment tension of Enter the Gungeon, there's a good chance you'll click with Hostile Lands. It's not just another roguelite shooter, it's got enough systems, charm, and challenge to keep you hooked. Not every game needs to reinvent the genre. Sometimes it just needs to know exactly what it's doing, and do it well. That's what Hostile Lands is aiming for. And based on what's already here, it's hitting more than it's missing.